Good evening and welcome to Face for the Newsfirst team. I'm Newsfirst. We have with us this evening Mr. Kusum Wijetilleke, who is a member of the working committee of the SJB, no stranger to our viewers. Welcome. Good evening, Kusum.
Thank you very much for having me, Niresh. Appreciate it.
Right, Kusum. So it's been a couple of months since you were on this program. And we thought we'd check in with you and see what's new with the SJB and the opposition in terms of strategy, because there is a local government election coming up probably in about 7 weeks' time. And therefore, what's the strategy, not just for the local government election, but beyond? So let me ask you, we know there were negotiations or talks, discussions going on with other opposition parties. Anything concrete come of them yet?
I'm afraid I don't have any news on that front, Niresh. I know everyone's waiting to hear of any potential alliances for the SJB. At the moment, I think we saw the opposition leader discuss the budget, and his criticism of the budget I agree with largely. We waited for this day for some time for the NPP to come forward with enacting some part of its agenda. I think the budget, a lot of people have called it very progressive. Some people have called it record-breaking in terms of capital investments and all that. But the fact of the matter is this is an IMF budget. They have not really gone beyond the parameters set by the IMF. They are sort of given into the IMF framing of the economic structural issues that we have, and sort of left behind the NPP's own critique, which is what the opposition leader said recently, is that they've sort of betrayed their mandate in a manner of speaking, because the moves that they're making run counter to what they said they would do. So I think the SJB needs to be very clear that, especially since you mentioned the upcoming local government elections, and even in the provincial council elections, if you ever have one, that this budget shows that the NPP government haven't quite understood the seriousness of the problem. They think that if we just move along, trudging along at the same way that the previous government did, that we will reach economic growth, that we will get debt sustainability. That's not going to happen when people's cost of living is still unmanageable. It's not going to happen when there is, no reason for industry to grow. There is no impetus for new businesses, for entrepreneurs. We have some of the highest electricity costs in Asia, and as I mentioned before, the debt sustainability issue. So how is Sri Lanka going to grow? Where is that growth going to come from? So unfortunately, the people, I think, will have to understand that whatever solutions they thought were coming from the NPP, they're not forthcoming. And this is the message that the SJB has to take to the grassroots and tell people that, look, you all expected, root and branch change in the way our government works and how our economy works. That's not happening.
So do you think that as one of the strategies for the local government election in particular, that, pointing out that this budget and the NPP government's policies in general, according to the SJB, have not borne fruit, and that the NPP has not actually kept to its promises? Would that sway the voter towards the opposition?
It's a fair question, Niresh. I think the opposition has one of two challenges, right? One is to show people that the government isn't working for them. But the other more important fact is also to drive them towards the opposition, drive them towards the SJB. That's a far more challenging aspect, right? It's easy for a government that's in power to be unpopular, but where people flee that government to is the real question. The political environment at the moment is in flux. I think there's alliances all over the place. We see that the NPP government themselves have sort of moderated their policies. In that effect, it leaves a hole on the left of Sri Lanka's politics. The SJB isn't willing to fill the left side of that spectrum for whatever reason, even though they ran on social democratic principles and social market economy. On the other hand, Ranil Wickremesinghe's very small group of politicians, members of the New Democratic Front on the gas cylinder, they're sort of blaming the NPP for, preventing liberalization prior to this. And now they're saying, well, now you finally come around to, our budget. You've come around to doing the things that Ranil Wickremesinghe had always said we should do. And that's what the NPP have to contend with. And I think, as I said, if the SJB can just drive this message home and say that, look, the SJB was very clear when we ran in the presidential and the general election. We're going to renegotiate aspects of this IMF program and find a way to enhance growth, and do so by focusing on exports. What you'll notice in this current budget is that it treats importers and exporters roughly the same. There doesn't seem to be an understanding that Sri Lanka's problem is not fiscal. It's a current account deficit. It's a trade deficit. It is a problem of foreign currency inflows. The NPP seemingly understood this because some of what I just said is reflected in its manifesto, but absolutely none of it is seemingly reflected in its budget. So I think in that sense, the SJB must show that we were a real option. We were a definitive option that's different to what came before, something the NPP also promised. But I don't think these superficial increases in the quantity of spending for health and education, even though the health education spending as a percentage of GDP is the same as it's been before. So they haven't really, you can't call them progressive in that section. You have to find some other reason to call them progressive. And I'm not saying this budget is completely, I think it's a much better budget than what's come before. But I think that's a very incrementalist way of thinking, because our problems cannot be solved by incremental changes, which is something that I've been trying to emphasize.
So you mentioned that this budget hasn't really given any impetus for economic growth, especially exports. And you also use the term trudging along. You think that's a fair assessment, that if all goes according to the budget, that this time next year would we see any growth of significance? Would we see,
if I'm not mistaken, the budget called for is projecting 5%
of
growth?
Yes.
I don't think we've reached 5% very regularly. I think we are more an economy that goes between 2 and 4%. I'm pretty sure the central bank, I'm pretty sure the IMF and the ADB have both said they expect 4% growth, not 5% growth. But okay, let's take the government at 5%. 5% growth, when I assume a large portion of this growth, maybe 80% of the growth, will come from the domestic economy, which is fine. I'm not saying that's a bad thing. But the problem with that is that we are supposed to make our debt more sustainable, and we have external debt issues. So external debt means foreign exchange inflows. So the domestic economy growing does not necessarily mean that we're going to get more foreign exchange inflows. It might mean the opposite, because imports tend to go, because we're an import-dependent economy. So I see that as a fundamental issue that this NPP government hasn't seemed to wrestle with. We really should have seen an industrial plan, industrial policy. And again, I'll reiterate, it's something that was mentioned in the manifesto. But those things have fallen by the wayside when we come to actual governance. So I don't know, who they're protecting. I'm not sure what the overall strategy is. But I think everyone knows, you'll know this, from the early 2000s on, we've been talking about value addition to tea, expanding our value addition to rubber, expanding the garment trade. But we need to build new industry. Sri Lanka hasn't had a new industry in about 30 years. And we're not going to build new industry unless we attract investment. And foreign investment comes for very specific things. It comes for low energy costs. It comes for skilled labor. It comes for a good business environment. I don't see any of that changing, but I'll add the caveat that it's only 4 months. And, I came here on your show a few months ago and I said the same thing. It's early days and let's give them the time and the space. But the new budget does not suggest that we are making any serious inroads into the major issues that exist in the economy. Just take the revenue target. Now, the whole game of this IMF project is a revenue-based fiscal consolidation. And even then, we see that the majority of the growth in revenue that the government expects, the majority of that revenue growth is coming from indirect taxes, which is VAT, which is a consumption tax. So what does that mean? That means people with lower incomes spend a larger proportion of their incomes on consumption. So if you charge VAT and you're putting most of the burden on the consumers, on the middle class, on the working class, this is not going to change the dynamics of our economy. The IMF advised us as far back as 2016 to change our ratio of indirect to direct taxes. I think this budget is likely to make that worse, not better. So I'm not sure how we're supposed to develop as a country and grow when people don't have money in their pockets, when people don't have savings, when people don't have money to invest, buy a new house, improve their living conditions, educate their children. If everything is a matter of debt, there's nowhere for people to turn.
Now, in such a situation, do you see the brain drain situation worsening? Because that's been a key area in the last 3 years, and so many people have left, and they're still leaving. But we don't talk about it as much as we used to. It was pretty bad in 2023, 2024, but we don't seem to talk about that very much. But when you look at this particular budget, do you see anything in it which would convince people to stay, especially those in the upper middle class who are required as managers, as senior executives, as CEOs, and so on?
I mean, I see very little in the way of incentives, and this is one of the problems I mentioned. They've sort of used the same Excel sheet from Ranil Wickremesinghe's finance ministry, and increase the spending here, increase the tax here, and they've given us something that satisfies the IMF. I think the conversation right now is about the tax exemptions for dollar incomes, right? So there's two conversations. On one side, you think everybody that's earning an income should pay some level of tax. And in my opinion, the level of tax, 15%, is already concessionary. It's already a lower rate than somebody else earning a rupee income would pay. Now, whether there is an impact of an increased taxation on dollar incomes, if that impacts dollar investments in Sri Lanka, it's hard to say. But most certainly, if you're going to tax people more on dollar income, it gives them the incentive to look at other markets, to keep some money abroad. It gives them the incentive to buy assets abroad to help with their savings and investments. Then you start to see people thinking and seeing a life for them. Even if you're a professional working for a multinational in Sri Lanka, you could very well base yourself in another country, because digital nomads is a thing now. People are trying to attract high-earning people that don't need to work from a specific location. So I think that's why every part of these economic factors are connected. And you can't change one thing here without changing something somewhere else. And what you see with this 15% tax on dollar earnings, they're fiddling about at the margins without looking at the central issue. Even if you got every single dollar earning professional in Sri Lanka to pay their full 15% on every dollar that they earn, that's not going to solve our fiscal balance. That's not going to even come close.
But this 15% tax, I'm a little confused about it, because if you are someone who is smart enough to earn in dollars, that means that you're providing a service which is of international standard. It could be in IT, it could be in accounting, whatever. If you are smart enough to do that, you are smart enough to simply go to Dubai or Seychelles or Mauritius or wherever and open an account and have your savings, your remuneration remitted there, or part of it.
Yeah.
So
yes, certainly, that's a very good point, and I think it, in a sense, these things can incentivize people, moving their lives abroad. And the problem here is that you're trying to fix this income tax problem. Sri Lanka has one of the lowest income tax to GDP ratios, I think, in the world amongst our peer group. I think something like 1 to 2%. But take corporate tax to GDP. I think over the last 10 years, I saw a statistic. Our corporate tax to GDP is 1.5% over the last 10 years on average. And I think last year it reached 2%. So 2% corporate tax to GDP in a context of a revenue-based fiscal consolidation is terrible. That means the corporate sector that earns the most profits isn't contributing enough relative to income compared to peer group countries. And this is a problem. And I think this report mentioned that we have the same 36, 34, 28% tax rate slab. So our tax rates are no lower or no higher than the average. But the effective tax rates are much lower. People are finding loopholes, tax holidays, tax breaks. They're finding ways to forego tax. I saw another report from the IMF that showed something like 950 billion in tax breaks for the corporate sector in 21 months. 21 months, 900 plus billion rupees in taxes foregone. That was customs duty, VAT foregone, BOI companies getting tax rebates. So on one side, if you've given out all these tax breaks, at least have the decency to show us what these companies have done with the tax breaks. At least say, we've created this much employment. We've had this much foreign exchange inflow to the country. We have developed this part of the country. Show some benefit to the country to make up for all this lost tax revenue, but you're not getting either. So these are the things that this government needs to address and do so quickly, because we don't have a lot of time, because every year that goes by, we're getting closer to another debt repayment. This year alone, I think we have almost 3 trillion rupees in interest payments against 5 trillion rupees in revenue. So that's over 50% of total revenue that's going towards interest payments. So where are we going to be when we have to start repaying capital and refinancing some of these facilities? It's anyone's guess.
Now, you've been in banking and finance for a long time. Do you see any hope, really, that we won't be going back to the IMF in a couple of years?
The thing is, Niresh, all I can say is, looking at the projections of the IMF themselves, they are showing Sri Lanka's total debt to GDP to be over 100% throughout the next 10 years. I think maybe from 2032 it comes to below 100%, it comes to about 95% in 2032. Sri Lanka has never sustained such long periods of such high public debt to GDP, as well as having external debt to GDP of over 60, 65, 70%. External debt as a percentage of GDP actually goes up in the next few years before reducing slightly by a few percentage points in 2030. So all the figures suggest that we will be in a very tight situation come time to resettle our bonds. And remember, I wrote about this in a recent article, that the international bondholders have gotten themselves an extremely good deal with these macro-linked bonds. So in essence, they've lowballed our dollar GDP as the base case scenario. So by some estimates, we've already exceeded the base case that the IMF suggested. So we are now in either upside basket 1 or upside basket 2, which means our dollar repayments actually increase. So Sri Lanka's in a weird position where the more our economy grows, the faster it grows, the higher the debt repayment and the higher the debt distress. So that's a very strange set of incentives to have in our economy. So I don't see how we can avoid going back to the IMF before 2032. I think it's likely to happen. I know some people who've been on your programs have said that even as early as 2029, 2030, we will have problems. That's just looking at the data. That's just looking at the numbers. In 2016, when we approached the IMF, we only had public debt to GDP of below 80%. And we were having debt sustainability issues at that time. So if you're going to say, Sri Lanka another 5-6 years with debt to GDP at 100%, it seems very unlikely, Niresh. And you mentioned, because I'm from the banking sector, I'll just say that banks have started showing great results. You would have seen the last few weeks, mainly on account of impairment reversals and the reversals of from the bond agreement. Some of those transfers have led to 5-10 billion rupee increases in the profits. But you have to all pay attention to is the impairments, is the non-performing loans. All banks have seen an increase in their non-performing portfolio. I think some banks have it as high as 15%. Some major banks have 12% non-performing from their total portfolio. That's a lot. That's a lot. And if the entire banking sector is like that, it's not 1 or 2 bad credit decisions by a few banks. It's a system-wide issue. And if that continues at the same trajectory, again, that's another problem. So the economy, I think we've had this problem where we're talking about stability, but we have to understand that stability is something that you fight for day in, day out. It's not a guarantee. Just because you're stable today doesn't mean you're going to be stable a month from now. So we shouldn't be so comfortable in this basis of this idea that we are in a stable environment, because debt repayments will start. It's coming.
But, okay, I have had a major issue with this word stability since the last regime started bending it around, which was about 9 months ago, saying that, well, what Mr. Ranil Wickremesinghe's regime said was, we've got petrol, we've got gas, we've got diesel, we don't have queues for those, we're stable. But that is not stability. That's just getting by, just buying the oil and refining it and selling it at the petrol sheds is not a stable economy. So I don't see, yes, things are better now, but to my mind, we have a long way to go before I would use that term, stability. Because as long as the economy isn't growing by leaps and bounds, as long as jobs aren't being created in massive numbers, I don't see this country as being stable yet.
And I think there's going to be a salary increase for the public sector. I haven't seen anything about retrenching any parts of the public sector either. I think every IMF review paper talks about, this issue of public sector jobs, and it's a problem that Sri Lanka has. Everyone knows about it. No one's willing to do anything about it. So how do we go? 1.5, what is it? 1.7 million people work in the public sector.
Nobody really knows. It's you see the numbers 1.5 million to 1.8 million, depending on whom you ask.
Yeah. So I mean, these are the things that you have to tackle, right? Everyone knows that if you can't, the private sector has to be the driver of growth, not the public sector. The public sector can be strategic, giving you some kind of pathway to growth. It can set the conditions, the macroeconomic stability says nothing about personal, on a personal level, what kind of stability you will have. The country might have 5% GDP growth, but if you're barely making ends meet month to month, if you don't have the money to invest in your child's education, or if you have to take a loan every time your car breaks down, if you have to use a credit card every time you go out to have dinner, I don't think we can call this stable. I think we can all pretend that we are in this sort of growth stage, that things are getting better. You'll get a better bonus than you did the last year.
I mean, don't get me wrong. We are doing better now than we were in 2022 and 2023, and 2024 was better than the previous 2 years, and hopefully this year will be even better. But we had hit rock bottom, where people were literally dropping dead in petrol queues where they had been sitting there for 5 or 6 days. So you can't get much worse than that.
Yeah.
So the fact that we are better than that doesn't speak volumes for the position we're in.
But this is how the political class gets away with it. The political class gets away with it by pointing to the worst conditions that we've had in multiple generations and saying it's better than that.
Yeah, but Kusum, that doesn't work, because we are a nation which has millions of people overseas, and those people know, and their relatives know, that the rest of the world has passed us by a long time ago. We used to be the envy of Asia 75 years ago, and now, I mean, how many countries in Asia are actually worse than we are? There are a few, but not many. So just saying that, hey, we've got petrol, doesn't really work. You need to start creating jobs and expanding the economy in a big way. Now, this particular budget, yes, it's got a lot of welfare aspects and so on, which of course had to be done in many aspects, because so many millions of Sri Lankans are below the poverty line. But is that going to drive the growth in the midterm, let alone the long term?
Yeah, we keep coming back to this issue of economic growth, but domestic consumption-driven economic growth is only good on paper, right? Unless we start diversifying our foreign exchange inflows, we're not going to get anywhere. Every country has an industrial sector. Sri Lanka's industrial sector is just not developed. It's not diversified. It's not high technology. Think of countries that you might consider as service economies, like Singapore, Hong Kong. These countries have massive export sectors. They export high precision instruments, machinery, semiconductors. They're part of global value chain. So they've increased their service sector components in their economies over time. But that's why you call these countries industrialized nations. This term has sort of gone out of fashion. for various reasons. But those days you used to call advanced nations industrialized nations because they've industrialized, because they have developed manufacturing capability, which therefore makes them valuable to other countries because they build something that the people in those countries want. What does Sri Lanka build that anybody wants? Very little. And I think we can keep going on about tea and garments, but unless we embed ourselves in these global manufacturing chains, it's not going to go anywhere. And the thing is, as you mentioned, the budget, it doesn't incentivize investment in that sense. You know, it doesn't tell a private individual, an entrepreneur, go and get it. This is the sector you have to go into. Because I think there is this concept in economics in Sri Lanka that the government shouldn't be picking winners and losers. Okay? So if the Vietnamese government, the Chinese government, Hong Kong, Singapore, if they just said, yo, let's just not pick winners and losers, I'll guarantee you none of them would have an EV sector. None of them would have a high manufacturing sector. Because the government has to tell the private sector, in conjunction with deliberation, these are the sectors where you can make money. This is where we are incentivizing you to invest in these sectors.
But we have seen that before with President R. Premadasa, where he said 300 garment factories, and it worked. I mean, that's one of the cornerstones of our economy right now. But ever since that regime, I really haven't seen any focus on any particular industry. And we're still talking about tea. For goodness sake, that's a 200-year-old industry, and it's not exactly going to drive our economic growth. It's I mean, it's great to have it, and it performs wonders. But you know,
what I think everyone needs to appreciate about the 89, 1990, 1992 era about the garment sector project is that yes, Mr. Premadas was central to this, right? It's one of his main projects, but it's not that he plucked this industry out of the air, right? There was a global movement of trade in garment sectors away.
Is it that Sri Lankans, including the business leaders, including the political leaders, don't understand the nature of global economics, of global supply chains? I mean, you mentioned countries like Singapore, Hong Kong. If Singapore were to disappear tonight, it would be felt. I mean, because it's interconnected. There's so much that the world depends on. Singapore or Hong Kong or Malaysia or Taiwan or India. But if Sri Lanka disappears overnight,
Sri Lanka's
no
fallen,
one would miss us.
Sri Lanka's fallen victim to this rentier capitalism model, right? Where industrialists in Sri Lanka, if they're protected, they can make money, right? If you protect them, they'll make money. But as soon as you allow imports to come from another country, none of our products are competitive. And it's not to say that protectionism is all bad, but I think to a certain degree, we have to open up ourselves to competition. And I don't see that happening in a lot of industry. I think the problem is industrialists have a lobby in Sri Lanka. And that's why we've seen protections across industries, right? So Sri Lankans could be having cheaper products, but not made in Sri Lanka, right? So I'm not saying now there's been the impacts of this is kind of a way of describing neoliberalism. The impacts of this have been devastating in other parts of the world. But at the same time, if our cost of living is too high, there's no point in helping a Sri Lankan pen manufacturer to thrive, right? Because those pens have only utility in Sri Lanka. They're not competitive anywhere else in the world. So then what's the point in allowing us to keep manufacturing that? But then that person has to move into diversify into a different sector, something that requires a little more engineering input, something that requires a little more planning. And that is where the government has to step in. And that's not an easy thing to do. So that what I was saying about Mr. Premadas is that they took this movement globally of moving away from creating garments in European countries and other countries and even Asian countries and moved it to lower cost labor places. So those kinds of movements of trade flows are happening all the time. They happened during COVID when masses of businesses left China, because of the zero COVID policy. There are movements, but there has to be a constant deliberation between the private sector and the public sector, between policymakers and entrepreneurs. How do we take advantage of the opportunities that exist in the world? What are the markets that are growing? Where can we export to? What is the expertise we have that we can, with a little bit of help from the government, with a little bit of government investment, with a few with a little bit of support from some government agency somewhere, we can do a lot of things with entrepreneurship. The government doesn't have to own anything, it doesn't have to control anything, but it has to have a plan for the entrepreneurs. Entrepreneurs will always look at making a margin and making a profit, which is fine. That's what entrepreneurs should do. But you have to feed your entrepreneurial drive into your national objectives. And that means driving them into the export sector. That's, to me, the only way out.
But this need to identify what the world actually wants, not just what we can give it. I mean, and to integrate with the global supply chains. This is what is needed to create jobs, isn't it?
Yes.
But who should identify this? I mean, if you're an entrepreneur, it's much easier to do something else in Sri Lanka, set up an apparel firm or a hotel, or do something which is traditional.
Yes.
Build
a few rooms in a tourist destination.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah.
But no one's actually saying, look, Sri Lanka needs to integrate in this industry. This is something that we can do, and here are the incentives. Go do it.
Yeah, I mean, just think, how would a manufacturing company survive in Sri Lanka with these energy costs? How is our transport system? How is our labor force? How is our business environment? How easy is it for a foreigner to come and invest here? Can he get his business licenses? Can he get his approvals? How is the construction cost if he wants to construct a factory or a warehouse or something? So none of these things that I mentioned have fallen into place yet. I don't see any active involvement from the government to improve on these, the factors of capital. We are just not geared towards introducing capital to Sri Lanka. And, that's a shame, because the NPP seem to understand that for the economy to grow, you need investment. But then there is also this thinking within the NPP that foreign investment has this connotation, right, that you're taking something away from Sri Lanka. And I think that if you think like that, we'll be stuck here forever, because foreign investment is...
The world depends on foreign investment.
The whole world runs on foreign investment. I mean, how Singapore today has multinationals is because local companies got involved with multinationals and developed their own products. That has to happen in Sri Lanka as well.
Now, another point that you mentioned about FDI, foreign direct investment, is that the state sector is so huge, and of course it's riddled with corruption and inefficiency. So now two pillars of the NPP's economic drive have been anti-corruption and digitalization. Do you think that'll work?
It's
again, it's early days,
and I think whenever we try to make the point that solving corruption on its own does not solve our problems, it's a big part of it. It's a necessary condition. It's not a sufficient condition, because I don't know if most people realize this, but countries like Hong Kong, Vietnam, there's plenty of corruption. Let's not fool ourselves. But it's not systemic in the way that it is here, where everything is, a con job. Every government institute can be a con job. That's not going to work. So, I mean, I have hope at least that this government will ensure that it doesn't interfere in corruption investigations. But at the same time...
But is that enough? Really?
Again, 4 months in, I want to give them the space, right?
I have consistently questioned this with many of my guests for many months. This hands-off thing, okay, no politicians are going to interfere from the side of the government. But politicians from other parties will interfere.
Yeah.
They've been part and parcel of this whole thing. And the investigating agencies are riddled with corruption. We know this. I mean, Inland Revenue, Excise, Customs, the police. So if it's hands-off, does it work?
Neeraj, do you get a feeling of deja vu from 2015, 2016 a little bit, where, the new government came in with all these promises of cutting corruption? We have the details of the amounts of money made from projects. We know how much commissions. We know where the money is stashed, the accounts in Dubai. All those things were said by that Yahapalne government. But to this day,
Nothing
we are still
happened.
waiting for the results, right?
Nothing
There's no
happened.
results at all.
Absolutely.
So I really worry that we're having the same thing, because let's face it.
But there have been a few high-profile indictments.
But let's take a look at the emblematic cases, yes. Right? The VFS, the bond scam. I heard today Mr. Mahendran there again. One of the ministers has said that we have a legal issue with, extraditing him from Singapore. The same excuse that Mr. Wickremesinghe gave during his period, right? So I worry that some of these emblematic cases also are not getting the attention, because I don't hear anyone talking about the VFS scam. It's almost as if, oh, we cancelled it, so there was no scam. But that's not the point. How did it get approved? What is the process for approval, and how have we changed those things? Who are the people involved? So, and the spate of underworld killings. I mean, Niresh, you report on the news. I consume the news every day. How often are witnesses and gangsters going to be killed while in police custody? This is becoming a regular occurrence. You arrest someone, take them to the police station, and then you take them back to a crime scene, a drug raid in the middle of the night, and then there's a shootout and the guy dies. And this has been happening from 2010, 2012, the Valikada prison riots, extrajudicial killings, that's what's being alleged. Madush, Koskora Taraka, all these people were killed while in police custody. And this time the person was killed in the courtroom. And we are still, so is the police going to be overhauled? Are we not asking questions of police members, how this keeps happening? Or are we just supposed to think that every time it's just an unfortunate incident that a major witness or a criminal was killed?
Well, no one's shedding tears for the criminals, but the way it's done is just ridiculous, isn't it?
And I think they've also arrested a few people under the PTA. Now, yes. You and I will be happy because you're arresting members of the mafia on the PTA, but we'll be happy until the day we become mafia, right? Until the day that someone from the government points a finger at him and says, no, he said this, he's disturbing the peace, he's going against national interests.
Well, I'm never, as a journalist, I'm never happy about the PTA. I believe the penal code is quite sufficient. Yeah. We don't need the PTA at all. Yeah. It's just bad news for any media person.
Because it's gangsters and narcotics criminals today, but it could be activists tomorrow. It just happened a year ago under the previous government.
It's a very small step.
It's a very small step. Yeah.
Absolutely, and we do have a movie running right now about Richard D'Souza's murder.
Yes. Yes.
So we see that it's a very small step indeed.
Yeah, I mean, I have this the problem I see with the opposition right now is, in a lot of ways, members of the opposition from the SJB and other opposition parties, they are criticizing the JVP of the 70s and 80s. But their criticism should be of the NPP of 2024 and 25. Because that party, the insurgent party that ran the election, the insurgent candidate that won, those people have kind of disappeared. Now they sound very establishment. And some of the outcomes are also seeming like what came before. So I think that's something to keep an eye on.
Now, Kusum, you mentioned several times that it's early days. And this is what a lot of people, including the public, keep saying. Well, it's still 3 months.
I'm trying to be fair because I'm a member of the SJB. Yes, you'll say I'm being unfair to the new government.
I hear this, I hear this a lot from all quarters. At what point will people start saying, no, you've been here long enough, where are the jobs? Where is the anti-corruption? And at what point will the SJB say, it's enough?
I think it's a ticking time bomb, Niresh. I think every month that goes by, every month that we see people's lives aren't improving, every time a new scandal, because let's face it, there will be new scandals also. Forget about the old scandals. This government will definitely have its own scandals coming up. It's only a matter of time.
We certainly hope not, but...
it's only a matter of time. Just going on the law of averages, right? It will happen. And how they react to that, that's what's going to be important. At the moment, they're very confident. I see members of the party, Mr. Bimal Ratnayaka, for instance, the Prime Minister, Dr. Harini, they're very confident in how they speak in Parliament. They're very sure of themselves. I think this will change as the months go by, because when you realize that, the economic growth for one thing, it's a GDP growth has many problems as a statistic, but reaching it on its own is going to be challenging. Even if you reach it, there's still problems. Even with the tax revenue to GDP, I heard on this station on Face the Nation, multiple economists, very celebrated, well-known economists, essentially being happy that Sri Lanka is likely to reach 15% this year, projected 15% tax to GDP. Now, everyone can see, if you look at more successful countries, tax to GDP has to reach well above 15%. But the fact that even mainstream economists are saying this 15%, we are going to get there, so we'll be okay, we don't need to worry about the revenue side anymore, that's the kind of attitude that's going to get us back to the IMF. Because 15% tax to GDP in a single year is scratching the surface of where we need to be. The IMF has asked for 15% tax to GDP in 3 consecutive years, starting next year. And that's only 15%. Unless we get to 17, 18, 20%, we will never have the fiscal space to give to our industry, for our export sector. We will never have the fiscal space to really invest in education and health, to increase the ratio to GDP. None of those things will happen. That's why it's called a revenue-based fiscal consolidation, because you need more revenue. And I think this fudging about for 15% of dollar income and reducing the threshold from here and putting a few percent there, it's not going to work. Because
no, let me ask you a direct question about the local government polls. We know that the opposition parties, the SJB included, don't want it as soon as possible. It's a situation where many parties have said they'd rather have it later on.
The SJB stance, Niresh, as far as I know, is that they wanted a few weeks of recess, and they were going to speak to the election commission. They weren't asking the government to postpone. They said it's the election commission's mandate to do this.
Right.
They mentioned the O-level exams, and they mentioned the budget debates, because they said that for many of them it's difficult to be in, because you need all 40. We're a very small contingent in the opposition, right? So you need all 40 of them in the chamber. And it's difficult to do your debating and to understand the budget inside out when you also have to go and campaign in your electorates. So I think it's just a strategic thing as well, but also there are practical issues. But I don't think anyone in the SJB has called for elections to be postponed by more than a few weeks or maybe a month at the most.
Well, that's good to hear, but by all accounts, it's going to happen in late April. Or
it'll be a good litmus test, right? In some sense, I think we've seen some of the cooperative society elections come back. I don't put a lot of weight into it, but there is a trend. There's a trend away from the margins that we saw in the NPP. Well,
it's a litmus test not just for the NPP, but for the opposition parties, including the minority parties and, of course, the SJB.
Yes.
What are you expecting from it? Anything in particular?
I just think that if we see a broad movement of dissatisfaction towards the government, it gives the opposition party some impetus. Right now, after an election, when you 160 plus in parliament, there's no impetus, right?
Okay,
so
is the SJB still in shock? Because it appears so after 2 consecutive electoral defeats.
I think 2 cycles, Niresh, the thing is, it's never easy to lose elections, right? It doesn't matter if you're a 100-year-old party or a 5-year-old party. Unfortunately,
but Kusum, parties lose elections. Only one party can win. And we saw if you go back in history, Dudley Senanayaka's UNP got wiped out in 1970. Mrs. Bandaranaike's SLFP got wiped out in 1977. Those parties continued on. There's a resurgence. So why not just look back at history and say, okay, well, we did badly, but we're coming back strong. Instead of being sort of in a state of shock and still not coming out with a proper strategy, apart from expecting the NPP to sort of lose steam.
Now, Niresh, I'm a member of the SJB, right? But I'll say something that's not very controversial. The majority of the political class, from my party, from other parties across the political spectrum in Sri Lanka, politicians are somewhat careerist, somewhat opportunistic.
No, certainly.
Right. That's not a controversial claim, right? So when you lose an election and your party is still a 5-year-old party and your leader lost the presidential election, And let's face it, the general election performance was dismal, right? I'll say, being honest. There's always going to be these minor power centers that develop. There are people with ambition that didn't have their ambition fulfilled. So they need to, I guess, get some things off their chest. And even members, the general secretary of our party, the chairman of our party, they've all had their inputs. I think there's clearly some changes that are going to happen in the SJB structurally, but at the same time, this period is always going to be like this, where there's a little bit of desperation, unsure of where we are, that kind of thing. So I think you'll see the SJB organize themselves better in the next 3 months, in this election period and in this post-budget period, because now we know the direction of the government and we can see where it's heading. So it's much easier to critique.
Now, one of the reasons given for the heavy defeats in both elections was that the UNP sort of grabbed much of the right-wing vote. But are we going to have the same thing happening with the local government election?
Yeah, I mean, I never agreed with the premise that if you just add up Ranil Wickremesinghe's vote count and Sajid Premdas's vote count, that he would definitely won, because that assumes that Mr. Wickremesinghe's vote count was an SJB vote count. There's no evidence of that. There is evidence from exit polls and surveys to show that a lot of previously Rajapaksa inclined voters were more pro-Wickremesinghe inclined. The problem that the SJB and the UNP indeed have is that they are liberal parties. Liberal parties around the world are struggling because liberalism itself has become so malleable. It's become so undefined. Liberalism is sort of confused with tolerance, right, in a way. And Sri Lanka has a very center-left, nationalist center. Our country has always been that. That's why generally it's very difficult to get a majority unless you have some nationalist team as part of it. That's why when you try to go the Mangala Samaraweera route of attracting the votes of a minority of the majority and a majority of the minority, that's your governing coalition. I don't think that's going to work anymore. It's not consistent enough. Mr. Wickremesinghe struggled with this his entire career until quite recently, because he never had this nationalist sort of, people didn't have that perception of him. The SJB as a liberal party has also sort of fallen for that, where we don't really stake a position sometimes on certain issues because we want to remain sort of uncontroversial. I think the party has sort of learned from those mistakes, and I think the rhetoric will be adjusted as you go forward, because it's a big part of Sri Lankan politics is that 80% of the country is rural, and very small pockets of the country are upper middle class. So the SJB has to really widen its appeal. And that's not been easy for the UNP for about 20-30 years, and liberal parties in general. So that's where you have to find a way to expand your base, expand your tent. Now, what we did during the presidential election was the Samagi Jana Sandhana, which was expanding our tent. I said that myself. Failed completely. Have to admit that, right? Did not get the numbers that we wanted from the South, for instance. Did not get the numbers that we expected in Colombo. So there has to be a new way of tent building. And I think that will happen as this government goes along, when people become more frustrated, when they see that the NPP aren't really living up to their promises and they start looking elsewhere. That's where the SJB has to position itself.
And we're almost out of time, unfortunately, but one final question. After the local government election, which will be in a couple of months, there will be a lull in elections until the next presidential, unless the provincial council elections are held, and they have been much delayed. I can't even remember the last time I voted in a provincial council election. Provincial councils are, for all intents and purposes, defunct. Is the SJB going to push for provincial council elections to be held? In which case they could be held this year, or next year.
Well, provincial council elections are part of the constitution, and this is one of the contradictions of the NPP and the JVP, because JVP has traditionally been against the provincial council system. they've been very critical of provincial councils overall.
But
Now,
should it be up to whether I like it or you like it, or
No,
the
certainly
NPP
not.
likes it?
Certainly
I mean,
not.
if it's the law, shouldn't it? It's our sovereignty, isn't it?
Yeah, so this is where the JVP has, or the NPP has to carefully navigate its own base, right? Because a part of its base is vehemently opposed to, well, the Indo-Lanka Accord, the provincial council system, this devolution of power. The very concept of devolving power is something that is anathema to many voters of the JVP in the past. Now, with this new modern incarnation of the NPP, have their supporters moved along? Are they willing to look at the devolution of power, police, land? Or is the NPP and JVP ready to open up the conversation about provincial councils? Is the provincial council the best unit for devolution of power? Or is it just creating new power centers around the world? What about the mainstream Tamil national political mainstream? What are they saying? Because most of Mr. Gajendra Kumar, Mr. Sumantran, I know that Mr. Sumantran is not in parliament anymore, but these are people who lead the mainstream of Tamil politics, and they call for federalism, which is, or a federal model, which is sort of beyond the constitution. That's extra constitutional. So how does the NPP maintain its support in the north when many of the northern politicians are still speaking in federalist terms? So then they have to come and bridge that gap. So these are the conversations that the NPP need to have, and the provincial council elections is a good time to ask these questions, because the NPP will very conveniently say, "Oh, we're looking after the economy." But yes, but the job of the government is not just that. Exactly. So you don't want to sound just like Ranil Wickremesinghe. You should be able to, chew gum and walk at the same time, right? So that's what we hope to see. I think they've been promising a new constitution as well, right? So maybe that will have some of the answers.
Oh, I've been in journalism for 35 years, and I've heard this new constitution nonsense for all of those 35 years. So I'll take that with more than a pinch of salt, this new constitution.
You should definitely.
Thing. Although, of course, the NPP would very easily pass a new constitution on its own with its 159 seats in parliament. And I'm afraid we have to end here. Thank you very much, Kusum Wijetilleke, member of the working committee of the SJB, for being with us.
Thank you very much, Nilesh.
And thank you to you at home for watching. Don't go away, because the news is coming up next. Have a great evening.